So we're going to be discussing the soul, and I'm sure we can knock this out in less than half an hour. The soul, of course, is something that even the prophets were asked about, and it's not as if it's an easy topic to discuss. But I am kind of starstruck with our guests here, Sayyid Mustafa and Dr. Khaled. I think they can do a really good job of setting us up with the theological understandings and what the traditions of Islam tell us about the soul. So 3 questions that I'll pose to Sayyid Mustafa and Dr. Khaled, and you guys can start in your discussion, and then I'm hoping maybe Abdullah can interject when it seems relevant, maybe some further clarifications or comments about the concepts that our scholars raise here. So the questions posed are: what are the theories of the soul in Islam? How is the soul constructed? And what is the relationship with the soul and the physical body? So, which of you would like to start?
Thank you very much. I'm no longer the chair of Islamic Studies at UCLA. I'm the ex-chair. The chair of Islamic Studies now is Asma Saeed, who's a very good colleague. This conference is fascinating because theologians and clinicians don't often come into conversation with each other. The Islamic tradition is quite rich in its discussions on consciousness and what the relationship of consciousness to the physical body. I will make no effort to reconcile between psychology and theology because that's not my field. I will simply go through some of the highlights of Islamic theology in its discussions on the soul. Of course, we start out with the very powerful Quranic narrative in which as the reports go, the Prophet ﷺ is asked about the nature of the soul, and he doesn't respond, but the revelation comes shortly thereafter saying, they ask you about the soul, respond to them, the soul is its knowledge of the soul belongs to God, and you as human beings know little. Now, this Quranic revelation fascinated Muslim scholars through history. Is it a refrain not to think about the soul, or is it a warning that to tread carefully when trying to discuss the nature of life itself? And if one would summarize the rather large corpus of Islamic traditions on that derived in various forms or were inspired in various forms by the Quranic discourse on, especially not just the soul, the ruh, but on the nafs, one would summarize it in the following way. Muslim scholars tended to speak of 3 categories. The first category, al-qalb wa-ruh, the heart and the soul. And the vast majority of scholars concluded that in studying the prophetic tradition and various other traditions in Islam, that there is no material difference between the qalb and the ruh, that the heart and the soul is one and the same. The second category would be an-nafs, which could be translated as human consciousness, including instinctive orientations or the instinct within the human being. The third would be the aql, or the rational faculties of a human being. So we have three. Whether we use the word qalb, heart, or ruh, soul, or the second would be the nafs, the state of consciousness in a human being, and the aql, the rational faculty of a human being. The most fascinating thing in the first category in discussing the ruh, the soul, is that whether one approached it from a purely naqli or transmission-oriented perspective, or one approached it from a deductive perspective, Muslim scholars tended to end in the same place. There are fascinating discussions that I'm not going to go through about whether it's arad or jawhar or things like that, or jawhar qa'im bi nafs al-makhluq, etc., etc. These are more theoretical than we need. What is of essence to their discussions on the soul is the Quranic narrative in which Allah says that Allah breathed into human beings their life. And that has had a very powerful impact on the Muslim understanding of the nature of the soul. And the language that we often encounter, and I'm going to recite the Arabic language because a lot of people are not familiar with it, and it is intriguing to no end. So the typical language that we encounter when talking about the soul goes like this: لطيفة ربانية روحانية وتلك الطيفة هي حقيقة الإنسان المدرك العالم العارف. So that the soul is from Allah's grace, but it in and of itself is divine. It is in fact derivative from Allah, Allah's self. So we find language such as the following: الروح خليفة الله وهو مجتمع صفاته الذاتية كالحياة والقدرة والسمع والبصر والكلام والعلم والإرادة. Or, and I'll translate it in a second: روح الإنسان مضافة إلى روح الله وشرف الله الإنسان بأن أضافه إلى نفسه. And this is very powerful language, that the soul is derived directly from Allah. And this is, by the way, what I just read is Razi in his discussions. And it is the vicegerent of Allah. It is in every essence, in every sense of the word, divine in its essence and derivative and dependent on the divine. Now, if we think about the implications of this, they're quite profound, because all souls, all human souls, and there are discussions, by the way, about animal souls, but let's not get into that. But all human souls are divine, and they are contingently or derivatively so in every sense of the word. They are simply a part of the divine. One theologian, Ibn Aqil, put it in a way that I actually like. He said that in Christianity, divinity was limited to the persona of Jesus, whether Jesus is subordinate the Father, or not subordinate, the whole subordination debate, but that divinity was imbued and embodied in the persona of Jesus, while in Islam, divinity was given or recognized in all humanity and every human being without exception. Now, part of this is further elaboration on this latifa or taifa, as they say, this gift, this grace, this purely divine act, and some very fascinating language that we encounter in our tradition. So they say, for instance, that the soul يضاهي فيضان النور في السراج من السراج الذي يدار في زوايا البيت. That the soul is like the light that ignites in a room and spreads in a room, and the room becomes enlightened and becomes gifted with it until it's taken away from the room, and then the room changes its nature by becoming dark, very much like the human body in its relationship to the soul. Similarly, some remarkable language that modern Muslims have not built upon, and a lot could have been built upon. So, from Al-Ghazali, Hamd al-Ghazali says, الروح نور من أنوار جماله خلق الله الخلق في ظلمة ثم رش عليهم من نوره. That the soul is like light from God's beauty. It's light from God's beauty. It's as if creation is dark, and then Allah graces creation through the gift of divine light, and all of us, all human beings, are simply a manifestation of this divine light. Now, there are discussions about the eternity of the soul. Most scholars say that الروح باقية والجسد فاني, that the soul is eternal, but the body is not eternal. But what happens after death to the soul, there are discussions that go on. We don't need to get into them because they will take us a very long time. However, now that divinity of the soul, and it's imbued and anchored in beauty, has a relationship with the nafs, with consciousness, and with the aql, with rationality or reason. The soul itself is not affected by what happens to the nafs, to consciousness, or to the aql, to reason. That its divine essence is never mitigated or negotiated or degraded or deprecated. It remains divine regardless of what human beings do with their consciousness or with their reason. So what is the role of the nafs, reason? Well, scholars like Al-Razi, Al-Ghazali, Ibn Al-Qayyim, and others, Ibn Aqil, Ibn Abdul Barr wrote on it as well, deriving from the Quranic discourse, say that the nafs, consciousness, has three essential states: al-nafs al-ammara bis-su', al-nafs al-lawama, and al-nafs al-mutmainna. The first is the nafs, which is drawn to compromises and weakness, and it is your most base self that constantly calls you to gratify your impulses. The second is a conscientious nafs. It's a nafs, it's a reproaching nafs, which is, as we know, is mentioned in the Quran, which is a higher state, which actually calls you to your conscience and interrogates you for your decisions. And if you are able to strike the balance, the necessary balance with your nafs, you can reach the higher state of the nafs, which is nafs al-mutma'inna, or the tranquil self, the self that has achieved a balance or achieved a state of tranquility. In this, we find the scholars often talk at length. Imam al-Ghazali dedicates many, many pages to this idea that a human being is in a constant state of struggle to elevate the nafs so that it can match the beauty and the sublime essence of the soul. And in it, they describe the nafs as having 4 essential conditions. An-nafs as-sab'iyya, or the predatorial self. That self tends towards aggression and towards demanding more that is entitled to. This is the hubris self. This is the arrogant self. This is the self that is what's the word I'm looking for? Eccentric in its nature. And nafs al-bahimiyya, the second, which is a self. Al-bahimiyya comes from the word baha'im, or cattle, which is the self that tends towards consumption and laziness and inaction. This is sort of the self that makes you a couch potato, that makes you sit and watch TV for hours and bores yourself. This is the bahimiyya, is a self that just wants to consume without a purpose. And nafs, the third, is a nafs ash-shaytaniyya, which is the rebellious self. The self that shaytaniyya doesn't mean it's possessed, and doesn't mean that it's accompanied by shaitan. Some people who don't know how to read the sources, unfortunately, say things like that. But in fact, the nafs ash-shaytaniyya is a self that tends towards constant state of restlessness and lack of gratitude. Whatever it receives, it sees itself as entitled for more, and it sees itself constantly in a state of victimization and injustice. Rather than looking towards the rights of others, it simply looks towards its own entitlements. And finally, a nafs al-rabbaniyya, the sublime divine self. And the struggle, as described by Muslim scholars, resonates with the Quranic verse, فَإِنَّهَا لَا تَعْمَى الْأَبْصَارُ وَلَكِنْ تَعْمَى الْقُلُوبُ الَّتِي فِي الصُّدُورِ, that it is not the self, it's not your eyesight that becomes blind. The blindness is a state of consciousness or a state of ignorance. And upon this, they say that human being is in a constant state of resisting the predatorial self, the consumptive self, or the cowardly self, al-bahimiyya, and disciplining the rebellious self, al-shaytaniyya, in order to achieve the nafs al-rabbaniyya, the divine self, which is in harmony with the soul. If there's the disharmony between the soul, which is Rabbani, divine, and your nafs, the consciousness, which could drift away from the soul, that state of imbalance causes numerous emotional and existential problems. Now, what is the tool for achieving a balance between the soul, the nafs, and the ruh? And here, without exception, the emphasis is on the aql, the rational faculties. was reported that the Prophet ﷺ said, reported by Imam Ali, that the Prophet said, مَا خَلَقَ اللَّهُ خَلْقًا أَكْرَمَ عَلَيْهِ مِنَ الْعَقْلِ, that Allah has not created something more profound and more blessed than rational faculties and reason. Now, they go on to specify that when it comes to the relationship between the aql, reason, and the self, consciousness, the following is the language. العقل هو المستحق للسيادة والقهر لأن به الاعتدال والميزان والضبط. Aql is the one that should be in control, because through the aql you are able to discipline the self to achieve a state of harmony and to achieve a state of balance. And in fact, one of the passages that I've always been drawn to by Imam al-Ghazali in his Ihya Ulumuddin, he says, he draws a metaphor about the relationship between conduct and the soul, the aql, and the nafs, and says that while the soul remains divine, unaffected by how the aql negotiates the nafs, if in fact the aql fails to negotiate and discipline the nafs and elevate it, and I'll read the Arabic then translate it, الآثار المذمومة مثل دخان مظلم يتصاعد إلى مرآة القلب ولا يزال يتراكم عليه مرة بعد أخرى إلى أن يسود ويظلم ويصير محجوب عن الله. That if reason fails to negotiate consciousness, the nafs, properly, in order to put it, to place it in a state of harmony with the soul, misdeeds, failure to interrogate and to control yourself becomes like smoke. Smoke in a room that accumulates until it blackens the heart. And once it blackens the heart, the cumulative lack of attention to your divine essence, to the rububiyyah in you, leads to a darkening and blackening until Allah becomes mahjub, until Allah becomes concealed from you. You no longer are able to identify the divinity within you. Now this is theological talk. This is the way theologians like myself, the Sheikh Qazwini, speak. But to us is the truth. We don't know I don't know anything about psychology. Maybe Sheikh Qazwini knows a lot about psychology. He's a marvelous man who knows so much. One man that I truly admire and honor. Now what do you do with this? I'm not sure what do you do with this as a psychologist. But as a theologian, when someone comes talk to me, I say fight the smoke from accumulating in your heart, because it will darken you. And when it darkens you, you will no longer see your divinity. And when you no longer see your divinity, you no longer know your worth. And you start asking questions like, why am I alive? What is my purpose? Thank you very much. Terminology is tricky, and I'm very reserved in using the word soul, because it is truly min amrillah. It is truly the domain of Allah, and everything we say about it is speculative to a large extent, except that it is, as Allah tells us, as from Rawhillah. It's something divine. It's whether it's a product of an amr, a command or a will, or whether it is created before the physical body and then deposited or created after the physical body. And all of these are things that the medieval mind indulged into great length and to great extent, but in the modern world, the consequences of these discourses could be different. And let me just illustrate in the following way. It is very important in the way that we think in our contemporary world, in our modern epistemology, to acknowledge that human beings are a product of divine grace and have the sanctity of the divine. Now, there is, of course, a theological issue. Reminds me somewhat of the Christian debates about whether the Spirit, with the Holy Ghost, and and Jesus as God's Son, and so on, does this lead to a divisible God or a unitary God? And there are similar debates about which the issue that Sherman raised, similar debates about whether if the human being is divine, then what does this do to the issue of Tawheed? And so it cannot be that the human being is deposited with a part of God's soul, but rather is a product of God's command and God's will. These debates are very interesting for theologians and for academics and for philosophers, and they have a role in the world of theology, but I see them as risky for the common Muslim to indulge in. And for one thing, the text, even reading Ihya Ulumuddin by Ghazali, a lot of people, even the translation that was made, gets a lot of subtle things wrong. So, what's my point about this? My point is that the critical issue is that we acknowledge the divine entitlement to life for all human beings. And what is critical is that to acknowledge that all of us have a divinely, whether divinely ordained or divinely derived or divinely created worth. That when I talk to any human being and they say, why am I on this earth? I say, because you are from the divine. You are as if, I like that word, rush. It's a sparkling of light. You are from light, and you are light, and you are as if light sparkled. And it's a powerful and it's a very liberating concept and doctrine. If only Muslims re-articulate old ideas within modern epistemological frameworks, because that's very important. If you repeat the tradition without keeping in mind modern consciousness, you end up alienating a lot of people and you end up just confusing people. So now the idea of the Spirit, and which is the critical point of whether the point raised by Heather. Personally, I am very reluctant about all the discourses about the seat of the soul. I tend to be very suspicious about all the speculative arguments about the seat of the soul. You might know that there is a very old philosophical tradition, goes back to the Greco-Roman world, that had a great influence, was partly influenced by the Kabbalah and Judaism, and then had an influence on Christianity, and then Muslims elaborated a great deal about it, whether the seat of the soul is the spine, the heart, the brain, and then in the modern world, all the evolutionary material. I look at it with a great deal of suspicion, because we simply do not know, and anyone that claims to know is an act of arrogance. I mean, but what we do know is that we can talk a great deal about consciousness. We can talk a great deal about the role of reason in consciousness. We can talk a great deal about spiritual health. We can talk a great deal about a state of balance and tranquility, and resisting base desires in order to elevate human consciousness. All of these are issues that translate quite well to modern epistemology and modern frameworks. Unlike a lot of the classical debates, a lot of scholars tend to just repeat the classical debates while not keeping in mind the modern obsessions and the modern needs of a human being. Now, the other thing is that and this is something I wonder from the I wonder about when far mental health. As a theologian, I read material that psychologists write about mental diseases in which suicide, for instance, is not an autonomous act, where suicide is a product of some type of mental compulsion. As a theologian, I'm troubled by that, because in theology, suicide is always an autonomous and determinative act. I'm also wonder about how psychologists, how you guys, make sense of the fact that in Islamic Sharia, we have punitive measures for the consumption of alcohol, but a lot of modern discourses talk about addiction as something that is a disease, an illness, rather than an act that needs to be treated punitively. These are the types of questions that I would love to hear psychologists address. I'd love to be engaged in as a theologian, as a jurist, rather than have psychologists read the classical debates about ruh and nafs and qalb and fu'ad and so on, because I'm not sure that as psychologists you're going to get very far dealing with your patients. I want to know about addiction, I want to know about suicide, I want to know about, is it true that people can have certain damage to their frontal lobes that made them compulsively drawn to violence, and so my ability to address their divine essence is handicapped by some brain injury? Because that makes a great deal for me as a jurist and as a theologian, and it might call upon theologians and jurists to rethink their theological and juristic paradigms. So it's your turn.